Thank you very much, Letitia. I would just like to briefly summarize the discussions which occurred at the Museum Summit, which was really organized for the purpose of trying to develop protocols that museums will apply in dealing with their native collections, which is, of course, affects a lot of museums in this country. So just to summarize very quickly, I would begin, I guess, with an assumption that was made at the very beginning of the discussions, and that was basically that the giant in the room in terms of transformational events that have happened in the past generation were indeed the two repatriation laws passed in 1989 with the authorization of the National Museum of the American Indian, and then NAGPRA, which followed in 1990. And there were three impacts, if you will, from that legislation that are relevant in talking about protocols for how we treat native collections that sit in museums and that sometimes don't sit in museums any longer. The first impact was the literal effect of the repatriation laws. It required the return upon request and after due process of certain kinds of materials. Human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, cultural patrimony. They were all subject to return under the provisions of the statute, and pursuant to that statute and those provisions in the two statutes, there are tens of thousands of objects, if not in six figures at this point, that have been returned to Native communities. So that was one impact. But there was an intangible, aside from the tangible of requiring the return of certain kinds of material, and that was that the repatriation laws forever changed and altered in a very profound way the power relationship between contemporary Native communities and museums. And it shifted in a way that had not been true before. Museums had always been rather the temples on the hill. They were run from the top down and the inside out. And what the repatriation laws did was to require that museums treat and look at Native communities as a phenomenon from the outside in and the bottom up. And that was a fundamental change in the power relationship between museums and contemporary Native communities. And third, museums, as a result of that, altered the way in which they organize and operate themselves. So at the meeting, we discussed a number of those intersections that have impact upon this. First of all, we talked about museums qua museums. Large holders of collections on the one hand, such as the NMAI, such as the Autry, such as the Field Museum, the National Museum of Natural History, and tribal institutions, which, even if though they carry the name museum, they are often cultural centers intended somehow to buttress contemporary sustaining of Native cultures. We talked about the relationships between the Academy, which is in a state of great change, and it's the way it addresses and talks about Native collections. Quite frankly, the field of anthropology, cultural anthropology, has deconstructed itself and reconstructed itself in the past 30 to 40 years, so that Native people are no longer informants, but hopefully they're collaborators, genuine collaborators. So out of that discussion came the notion that there is an arc that we're looking at. We're looking at a new bilateralism, if you will, between museums and Native peoples. A bilateralism that leads to genuine collaboration in substance and process. And third, as a result of both of those two things, we have the mutual creation of knowledge, which is helpful to both the Native communities themselves as well as museums. And in that process, I think, we will be looking at ways to try to both educate the museum community and help sustain Native communities at the community level. That is the result of that mutual generation of knowledge through a process of general collaboration. A drop note, a very important one, was a discussion, if you will, of international conventions of relevance. In other words, laws that sit outside of the United States and the impact that they have too. And that includes a number of international conventions as well as the Declaration regarding indigenous populations. And that has impact, I think, on pushing institutions like museums to truly collaborate and have a mutually participatory relationship with Native communities. And I think the bottom line of all of that, after these protocols are developed, is that Native peoples, I think, will finally have achieved a very remarkable thing. They will be a clearer and poignant an important voice, a thread, if you will, in constructing and understanding the true breadth and depth, if you will, of this great cultural tapestry we call America. Thank you very much.